This is my presentation on Zitkala Sa. To start, I'd like to say that I am an ally, and following this presentation, I will work to maintain allyship. First, I'll provide a contextual framework or an introduction to the key figure Zitkala Sa. Zitkala Sa, or Red Crow, was a Yankton Sioux artist, teacher, activist, writer, and musician. In her lifetime, she was a teacher. She attended the New England Conservatory of Music and Earlham College. She published articles for Atlantic Monthly. She published a book of short stories titled American Indian Stories. She co-wrote the opera Sundance Opera, which I'll talk about later. She worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. She was the secretary for the Society of American Indians, which was the first civil rights organization for and by Indigenous peoples. She was a lobbyist. She was a key figure who influenced the passing of Indian Citizenship Act, which helped gain citizenship for Indigenous peoples in the United States. She founded the American Council of American Indians following her work passing the Indian Citizenship Act, and she served as its president for many years. I am not listing her accomplishments because they are surprising. I am listing her accomplishments as they will bolster a theoretical framework later on in the presentation. So her book, American Indian Stories, is a book comprised of myths, and it is a book that is a collection of oral histories written down in the English language. So Zitkala Sa writes about her experience growing up on the Yankton Sioux Reserve in South Dakota with a single mother. This is where Zitkala Sa would have received most of her knowledge concerning oral histories and traditions, and this would inform her written work. So her short stories and her opera were a documentation of oral histories and traditions. This was rare, as most accounts of ritual at the time were ethnocentric and written from the perspective of missionaries and anthropologists looking into rituals and projecting their own stories onto them. So this is someone who had experienced ritual and had listened to the stories firsthand and lived in the communities. And was Sioux. So she's not writing from this ethnocentric position. It's not an anthropology, it is a personal account. Next, I will talk about her Sundance Opera. The Sundance Opera, I think, is one of her most important works. And I think that it is most important because when these dances were banned, so when the sun dance, the ghost dance, dances that were so key in maintaining a culture and expressing a culture, when they were banned, Zitkala Sa found a loophole. She found a way to practice ritualistic dances despite these hegemonic powers. She inserted Sundance rituals into an opera. And this, at the time, I'd say, was commonplace and was established to insert into kind of this Eurocentric sphere primitivism. And Zitkala Sa doesn't do that this way, but it was welcomed by the audiences, these Eurocentric audiences, because at the time, kind of like it was commonplace to see this exoticization or primitivism. We can think of Picasso's Mademoiselle d'Avignon and the tribal masks in which he imposes on the painting. So this was kind of a common language that we were used to seeing in Eurocentrism. And Zitkala Sa just breaks that down. She uses this kind of opening, this welcoming, in order to insert her ritual into an opera. And this is the first opera written by an Indigenous person.
And so she's inserting her Indigenous identity into a Eurocentric medium.
Zitkala Sa, at 8 years old, was forcibly removed from her family, from her mother, on the reserve, and she was forced to attend White's Manual Labor Institute in Wabash, Indiana. And the boarding school is the equivalent of a residential school in Canada. But Zitkala Sa's experience at the Wabash Labor Institute was unique, as she learned, as she was forced to speak and write in English. But later, these were tools to resist. So she used these assimilation tactics that were implemented onto her within the boarding school, and she used this to insert indigeneity into these settler colonial spaces, into a settler colonial nation state. And later, as mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, she was a teacher. So later in her life, she became a teacher at the Carlisle School. And the Carlisle School was one of the first federally funded boarding schools, and it was founded by Richard Henry Pratt. So at her time teaching at the Carlisle School, she was able to kind of, as an older person, kind of digest what was going on. And so she disagreed completely with the way it was run, and she left the school and published works exposing their assimilation tactics in the Atlantic Monthly. So she uses English to write down oral traditions in order to resist. And she's been criticized as biting the hand that fed her, which is completely untrue. Her experience at the boarding school was successful as it assimilated her into a dominant culture. But it was not in the same light as she held on to modes of resistance. So I'm going to read an excerpt from her essay, which won second place in the Indian State Oratorical contest of 1896. We come from mountain fastness, from cheerless plains, from far-off, low-wooded streams, seeking the white man's ways, seeking your skill in industry and in art, seeking labor and honest independence, seeking the treasures of knowledge and wisdom, seeking to comprehend the spirit of your laws and the genius of your noble institutions, seeking by a new birthright to unite with you our claim to a common country, seeking the sovereign's crown that we may stand side by side with you in ascribing royal honor to our nation's flag. America, I love thee. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God.
This she reads under a banner that has a racialized slur written on it. This describes her as the other within the contest.
This excerpt is a reflection of her education at the Labor Institute. It is running parallel to their methodologies and tactics of assimilation, and she's basically writing what they want to hear. But this could be said that she's kind of creating a platform for herself in order to resist. She's creating an audience for herself. She's saying, I have, in quote, been assimilated. I have been assimilated into a dominant culture, into the settler colonial nation state, because that's what they want to hear. And therefore, if she is welcoming Eurocentrism, then they will listen to her, as her writing will seem as though it is using primitivism to degrade the other. But that's not what Zitkala Sa does. She uses this platform to write oral histories in order to create a platform to practice. So Zitkala Sa is not maintaining the other, but is creating a platform for Indigenous peoples to resist being othered.
I'm standing on one side of a river. Missouri. I found it on the map. One of two lines that isn't straight on Yankton. Reminder, Missouri River continues. It can see Rosebud, Cheyenne, and Standing Rock. It visits with them, or did, before the lines told them not to. There's a bridge now. One does not have to wade to get to the other side. I think of Zitkala Sa, the soft bottom of her moccasins she told us about, how they were probably wet a lot. She had to swim a lot to keep her opera afloat, to keep the pages dry, to hand them over to dry hands that had never dipped their fingers into riverbeds, but bought lotion that smelled of the Wild West or of river flowers, so that they could say, "The water is great. Do you have a bathing suit? A towel? Perfect. Come in. The water's fine." Her moccasins were never dry. Zitkala Sa learned how to oil them, young, so that she could be in two worlds at once. She knew that the bridge, if built, would be for high heels to pass, tradition squeezed into one heel, whereas the ground feels a whole foot of Zitkala Sa's, unassimilated. She knew that it was up to her people to learn the backstroke, fancy diving too, to learn new ways, own ways, of existing in colonial spaces. She was right. Boards have separated, swelled, and are loose. One has to distribute their weight or will fall through, back into dampness. I'm standing on one side of the river, but that's because I've never had to cross.